All right, let's look ahead to the medium-term budget policy statement and what can be expected. I'm joined by senior economics reporter Nompumelelo Siziba. Very good afternoon to you, Nompumelelo. We know that the finance minister has a large task on his hand, having to deal with high infrastructure spending, social spending as well, but against the backdrop of low economic growth, as well as less revenue collection. Lots of people using the word balancing act. What are people around you expecting, and what's happening where you are?
Thanks very much, Nzinga. Well, it's very hot here in Cape Town. We've got temperatures, north of 20 degrees. North of 22 degrees. It's very hot indeed, and I know you're chilly where you are. But in terms of expectations, obviously everyone knows that there is a problem with the balancing of the books. It's expected that we're going to see a wider budget deficit. In the February budget, the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, had estimated that the budget deficit would be anything around 4% of GDP. But now the expectation is that that could actually widen by 1 to 1.5 percentage points. If it does go beyond that 5% mark, there's an expectation that markets won't take that very, very kindly to that, and that the ratings agencies won't have a very positive commentary for us. We know we're already in junk status, which is negative, and government is having to borrow more money because there isn't enough revenue coming in, and because we're rated junk status, it means it's having to get that debt at higher interest rates. So, the finance minister is really between a rock and a hard place. He's been urging government departments to slow down or cut down on their spending. But of course, protest groups are saying that it's very important that the vulnerable are not overlooked in this process of austerity, that basic important services continue to be provided. So now the government, or at least National Treasury, is talking about cutting on things like infrastructure, but we need infrastructure investment in order to have a brighter future for our economy, which has been growing at really stagnant levels for the longest time. Well, I have with me an independent tax expert, Deborah Tickle. She's spoken to us on a number of occasions with midterm and main budget. Thank you so much for joining us, Deborah, as always. So I've kind of given a backdrop to what the issues are. What are your expectations? We know you wear a tax cap, and midterm is not usually a time that the finance minister talks about tax, but what are you expecting broadly?
Okay, afternoon. It's lovely to be back with you here. You've mentioned the debt problem, and the problem I see is that there's three places that the minister can procure some kind of relief. The first one is to increase debt, which you've said is not really palatable. And the main reason why I see debt not as being palatable is that in the budget they budgeted 340 billion rands worth of debt service costs. That's interest. The minister said last week that it's gone up to about 360 billion. So if you take that as a percentage of the amount of tax we collect, purely tax, which was just under 1.8 trillion in the budget, and we know that there's going to be a shortfall, we're talking about 20% of our tax take going into debt, or into interest. So if you take that as the amount of tax you or I pay, or all the listeners or viewers pay, 20 cents in every rand goes to paying interest. So let's just look at who's paying the tax. So we've got, if you go back to the stats, the latest stats, which is unfortunately 2020, but they're probably realistic, you've got just under 16 million people paying tax, of which 11 million earn between 0 and 189,000 rand. They pay 5.6% of the tax. The people who are earning more than 500,000 rand, they pay almost 65% of the tax. So you've got a very small pool. It's just over 1 million people, 2% of the population paying all that tax, paying those 20%. And if we look at the breakdown of the tax, we've got personal income tax, which is 35% of the total, VAT, which is 26% of the total, so that's just over 60% of it coming from individuals. Now those same people are paying most of the VAT, even though everybody pays VAT, so we're all in it together. But of all that, there's the total tax take can't really be increased. And he's not going to do that now anyway. There's been talk of VAT increases. He doesn't normally do that in this kind of budget. So then we're back to expenses. So what do you cut?
What do you cut indeed? But to your point about, you've told us about the sort of distribution of the lay of the land in terms of the taxpayer.
Yeah.
And those who earn decent amounts pay the vast majority of tax. There's been a constant recommendation by different parties that we should have a situation where there's a wealth tax. How practical do you think that is? And is it really true that high net worth individuals, or even not even high net worth individuals, but ordinary middle class people will take a hike the minute that the pressure's too tough when it comes to tax?
Well, I can't speak for how people will feel if they suddenly get more tax, but there is what they call the Laffer curve that says there's a point at which people have had enough. They'll either stop work or leave. It's debatable whether that's true or not. But a wealth tax is a big question mark, because I was involved in the Davies Tax Committee, as you know, and we did the wealth tax report, and people will have noticed on the 2023 tax return there's a question that says, do you have assets of more than 50 million rand? And if you tick yes, then it opens up and you have to give the value of all your assets. So SARS and Treasury are looking at what the wealth is in the country, because one of the big problems the DTC had was, what is it really? However, what we have to remember is that we have wealth taxes. We have estate duty. The last time they increased the abatement for estate duty was 2007. In between then, they've introduced luxury wealth taxes. They've introduced taxes that affect people who are putting their money into trusts. They've increased the dividends tax rate. They've increased the CGT inclusion rate. Those are what I call stealth wealth taxes. So if they want to introduce a wealth tax, which has been proven not to work elsewhere, in fact, India disposed of theirs in 2015 because it was the valuations were very difficult and there was more administrative cost to it than actually collections. So it wasn't worth it. What we should be doing, which is I believe what we are doing, is we should be administering our estate duty and our donations taxes better. And that's really where the high net worth individual unit at SARS comes in. And they're doing a great job of investigating people and making sure they're paying the right amount with these stealth taxes as well.
Yeah. So aside from a potential wealth tax, which you pretty much seem not to think is really plausible under the circumstances, what about the normal taxes, your personal income tax, your corporate income tax, as well as VAT? Many people saying because we're going into an election year 2024, it's a no-go zone. Do you think that's pretty much the case?
Well, politically, yes, of course. I mean, as I said before, VAT is paid by everybody. And that goes for the poor as well as the rich, even though the rich tend to pay more because they spend more. But the point is, even the zero ratings don't shield the poor sufficiently. So the call has been perhaps we need more zero ratings. But I agree with you, in an election year, it is not a good thing to increase taxes. And what we have to remember is that when the DTC put out its initial macro report, they suggested that a 3% increase in VAT is equivalent to either a 6% increase in personal income tax or a 5% increase in corporate income tax. Now, what we've seen since then is that corporate income tax came down 1%, which actually does probably collect more because there's less sort of avoidance that goes on. But personal income tax have already gone up 4% from 41 to 45. We've already had from 14 to 15, 1% of the VAT. So how much more inflationary pressure can you add on to this country? It's like they say, he's in this between a rock and a hard place, catch-22, whatever you want to call it. It's very, very difficult. So he's going to have to pull a rabbit out of the hat for the next 3 years. And the only real place is choose your spending well. Spend properly on the right things. You said about the poor. Yes, of course. The basic income grant, I mean, those people who are paying taxes are supporting almost 30 million people who are on either a normal grant, old age, disabled or children, or the relief grant of the 350, which is really not very much, quite frankly. Now, to take that away is just not on. But in the long term, they have to make a plan to bring that debt down in order that you don't have so much interest to pay. Because if the interest was less, consider this, the 360 is 9 times the amount we pay on the social relief grant per annum. So if you had less debt, you could pay more social relief.
Indeed.
So quite frankly, I have no idea what he's going to say. I think he's going to have to put it very, very clearly to the ministers that this is now serious stuff, and expenditure one way or another has to be controlled. I'm not saying cut this or cut that, but there has to be a very serious think about what is important.
Deborah, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your contributions, as always. Deborah Tickle there, independent expert on tax. She's an academic and she's had a long career in the tax field, and as she mentions, she was also on the Davis Tax Commission as well. So really, there are no answers, it seems, but the main issue is really government has to really look closely at its spending. There has to be a better handle on the finances that are available, less corruption, of course, so that money that's supposed to go to proper causes on the ground go directly there. There needs to be continued investment in infrastructure so that we can have an economy that's growing henceforth. There are some positive happenings, of course, with the working together of private sector and government on things like energy, crime and logistics, but that's in the working. That will take time, and the fruits of that perhaps we won't see for another 2 to 3 years. So yeah, it's going to be a tricky one, and we're going to have to wait and see what the finance minister has to say at 2 o'clock.